In this video, you'll learn how to develop functionality that lets a user reset their own password if they forget it. We'll be building on code created in the first video, where we developed Signup and Login functionality. So if you haven't seen that yet, there's a link in the description. All the code developed in this video is freely available, and a link to that is also in the description. So how is this going to work? What happens when a user forgets their password? They could ask us to email it to them, but we can't do that because we don't know it. Passwords are stored as hashes in the database. We deliberately have no way of getting to the plain text password. Any website that sends you a password if you forget it is storing them in plain text, so be very careful with that site. We could create a new password for them, either manually or programmatically, email it to them, and then save the hash in the database. But unless they think of the password themselves, they're more likely to forget it. Also, it would be extra work for us if we had to do it manually. Much better if we could give the users the option to securely reset their own password when they forget it. So how do we do that? Well, we could have a reset form where the user enters their email address and a new password, but this would clearly allow anyone to change any user's password, which would be ridiculous, so we can't do that. If we assume, though, that the user is the only one with access to their email account, then we can use that to reset their password. If we generate a unique URL, in other words, one that contains a unique token like this, we can send them this URL in an email. When they open the link in the email, they're taken to a form where they can reset their password. This form will identify the user using the unique token from the URL, which is linked to their user account in the database using a hash of that token. So the user can securely change their own password, and only their own password, to whatever they like, meaning they're less likely to forget it again. We'll start with the Signup and Login code from the end of the previous video. If you need this, you can get it in this repository. First, let's create the page where the user can provide their email address to start the password reset process. So let's create a new file in the root folder called forgotpassword.php. In here, we need the HTML for the form. To do this, we'll just copy the start of the HTML from the index page and paste it in the forgot password file. You might want to extract this out into a separate header file you can include on each page. But in the interests of keeping this video and the code as simple as possible, I'll just copy and paste it like this. In this code, let's change the title element, then add a heading element and the closing body and HTML tags. Then let's add a form that uses the post method. Inside the form, we'll add an email input with an associated label and a submit button. In the login.php script, after the form, let's add a link to this page. In the browser, on the login page, there's the link, and there's the forgot password page with its form. Next, let's add a script that will process this form when it's submitted. So let's add a new file called sendpasswordreset.php. We'll start this script with the PHP opening tag. Then let's get the value of the email that was supplied in the form. Back in the Forgot Password page, let's add an action attribute to the form so that the form will submit its data to this new page. In this script, we'll generate a unique token, store it in the database, and send the user an email with a link that contains the token value. Before we add code to do that, let's add fields in the database to store the token value. In the user table, let's add two columns. We'll call the first column reset token hash. This will be a 64-character varchar that accepts null values and has a default value of null. We'll also specify a unique index on this column, as we'll be using this column in a where clause. We'll call the other column reset token expires at. This will be a date-time type that also accepts null values and has a default value of null. Let's click Save, and there are the new columns and the index. A script containing the SQL to add these columns is in the code repository for this video, and a link is in the description. In the Send Password Reset page, first let's generate a random token value. We'll use the random bytes function for this, passing in 16 as the length. We need this token to contain characters we can include in a URL though. The random bytes function returns unprintable characters, so let's use the bin2hex function to convert this to a hexadecimal string. As with the password, for extra security, we'll store a hash of this token in the database instead of the plain value. So let's create a hash of this value using the SHA-256 algorithm. This returns a 64-character string, which is why the column we added to the database is that length. Next, let's generate an expiry for this token. So that a brute force attack can't be used to guess a valid token value, we'll make the token only be valid for a short time. If it does expire, then the user can just request a new one. The time function returns the current time represented as a number of seconds. So let's add 60 times 30 to this, which is the number of seconds in 30 minutes, meaning that the token will only be valid for 30 minutes. You can of course change this amount of time if you prefer. Then, to get a value we can store in the date-time column in the database, we'll use the date function, passing in a format string that represents the format the date-time values take in the database. 4-digit year, month, then day, separated by hyphens, then the hour, minute and seconds of the time, separated by colons. Now we have the token hash and its expiry, we can store them in the database. So first, let's require the database file we developed in the previous video, assigning its return value to a variable. Then, let's write the SQL to save the token to the database. We'll use an update query to update the user table, setting the token hash and the token expiry columns to the values above. To avoid an SQL injection attack, we'll use a MySQLi prepared statement. So for the values in the SQL, we'll just put question marks as placeholders. To identify the row we want to update, we'll add a where clause on the email column, again using a placeholder for its value. Then let's prepare the statement. Then we can bind values to the placeholders using the bindParam function. All the values are strings, so we'll pass in 3 S characters for the 3 string parameters, then the values in order of the token hash, its expiry, and the email address. Once we've done this, we can execute the statement. Let's give that a try. On the Forgot Password page, I'll enter the email address of a user that I know exists in the database and submit the form. The blank response is to be expected as we aren't outputting anything yet. In the database, for the record with that email address, we can see the reset token hash and the reset token expires at columns have been set. This worked because a record was found that matched the email address supplied in the form. However, if no record is found that matches the supplied email address, then no records will be updated. We can check for this with the affected rows property of the MySQLi connection. This is an integer containing the number of rows that were updated. If a record was updated, this means a record with the supplied email address was found. So now we can send an email to that address containing the token. To send an email from PHP, we'll use the PHPMailer library. And you'll need access to an SMTP server. I've already gone into detail on how to do this in another video. There's a link in the description. We'll install the PHPMailer package using Composer, with this command in the terminal, from the root folder of the code. This will install the package into the vendor folder. As with the database code, let's put the email configuration code in a separate file. So let's create a new file called mailer.php. In here, we'll start with the PHP opening tag. To use the PHPMailer package, we need to require the files the classes are in. You can do this directly, as described here in the PHPMailer documentation, or use Composer's autoloader, which does this automatically. We can also include some use statements so we can use PHPMailer's classes without having to include their full namespace. So let's add some use statements to import PHPMailer's classes into the current namespace. Then we'll require Composer's autoloader to load the class files. Then let's create a new PHPMailer object, passing in true to enable exceptions. We'll be using an SMTP server with authentication, so we'll call the isSMTP method and set the SMTP auth property to true. Then we'll configure the SMTP server. You need to set the host, authentication type, which is probably TLS, the port, username and password to those that your SMTP server uses. Note that in practice you'd probably put these values in a separate configuration file like a .env file, but for the purposes of keeping this video simple, we'll just hardcode these in here. One more setting we need to change is to enable HTML content in emails by calling the isHTML method, passing in true. Finally, in this script, we'll return the mail variable. Then, back in the send password reset script, we can use this script. So if the email address was found and there was a row updated, we'll load the mailer script we just created, assigning the return value of the require statement to a variable. Then we can set the properties on the mailer object for the message we're going to send. We'll call the setFrom method to set the email address of the sender. This is typically set to a no-reply email address at your domain name. Then we'll add the recipient email address, which is the email address that the user has supplied. Then we'll set the email subject and the body using a here doc. For the content of the email, we'll just specify a link to a file that we'll create shortly. Note that this needs to be an absolute URL. You can't use a relative URL as the link will be clicked on in an email client. The host name needs to be set to the host name of your web server, for example, localhost if you're developing locally. To send the token to the user, we'll include it in this URL in the query string. Then we can send the email using the send method. If this doesn't work, an exception will be thrown. So let's wrap this in a try-catch block and output the error details if so. Note that if you do have issues sending emails, here in the mailer script you can enable verbose debugging messages by setting the SMTP debug property to the debug server constant. Once the problem is resolved though, make sure you remove this line or comment it out. Back in the send password reset script, once the message has been sent, let's just output a message for now. Note that we're doing this at the end of the script, after the if block that checks if any rows were updated or not. This means that if the email address supplied by the user wasn't found, we'll display this message anyway. You could output a message saying that the email address wasn't found, but it's typical to not do this, and just say the message was sent anyway. This is an additional little bit of security that prevents someone from using this script to discover which email addresses are valid on your system. Let's give that a try. I'll enter an email address into the forgotten password form. Note that I'm using an example email address for this demonstration. You need to submit an email address for which you have access to the inbox so that you can see the email that was sent. If I submit the form, we get the message that the email was sent. In the email client, there's the email with the sender, subject and content that we specified. At the end of the send password reset script, instead of just outputting a message like this, it will be better to redirect to another page, just as we're doing in the process signup script when the signup is successful. I'll keep it simple, however, and just leave this message, but I recommend you do add a similar success page. Now we have the email with the token, we can add the script that processes it. So let's add the file that we're linking to in the email body called resetpassword.php. In here, we'll start with the PHP opening tag. The first thing we want to do in here is get the token from the query string. Then we can check if it's valid. As the token is stored in the database as a hash, before we can query the database for this value, we need to get its hash. Then we can use this value to see if there's a record in the user table that contains it. So let's get a database connection by requiring the database script. Then let's write the SQL to select the user record with a where clause on the reset token hash column. We'll use a prepared statement for this, so we'll include a question mark as a placeholder for the value. Then we can prepare the statement, bind the value of the token hash to the placeholder, and execute it. Then let's get the result set and an associative array of the user record if it was found. If no record was found, this will be null, so let's check for that and stop the script with a message if so. Even if a record that contains the token hash is found, it might have expired. To check for this, we'll use the string-to-time function to convert the reset token expires at column value to a number of seconds. If this has expired, then it will be less than or equal to the current time expressed as a number of seconds, which we can get with the time function. If this is true, then the token has expired, so we'll stop the script with a message. Next, for now, let's just print out a temporary message. Let's give that a try. If I click on the link in the email we just sent, we get the message saying the token is valid. As the token is in the query string, we can change it. So let's change this value, and then we get the message saying the token wasn't found. To test the expiration in the database, let's change the expiration date of this token to a date and time in the past. If we go back, now we get the token has expired message. Instead of showing this message saying the token is valid, we'll display a form that lets the user change their password. So we'll add the PHP closing tag and create an HTML document. We'll start with the head section, including the link to the style sheet from the other pages. In the body section, we'll add a header and a form. We'll add this process reset password.php script referred to in the action attribute shortly. Inside the form, let's add a hidden field for the token value so we can get it in the script that handles this form. We'll escape the token value as it is untrusted input. Then an input and associated label for the password, and likewise for the password confirmation. Finally, a button to submit the form, and the form, body and HTML closing tags. In the browser, if we have a valid token, we see the form with its two fields and the submit button. Then we can add the script that will process this form when it's submitted. So we'll add a new file called processResetPassword.php. In here, before we validate the supplied password and update it in the database, we still need to check that the token is valid. This will avoid someone bypassing the check we just added to the form. To keep it simple, in the resetPassword.php script, let's just copy these checks from the top and paste them in the processResetPassword script. The only difference is that now, however, we'll be getting the token value from the posted form data instead of the query string. So we'll get this value from the post array instead of the get array. Once we know the token is valid, we can validate the data from the form. In the process signup script, we're validating the password and its confirmation, then we're creating the hash of the supplied password. So let's copy these lines and paste them in the process reset password script. This is the required server-side validation for this data. If you want to include client-side validation for the password, then you can get this from the original sign-up form we developed in the previous video. Let's give that a try. So if I submit an invalid password, we get the validation messages. Once all is valid, we can update the password in the database. So let's create some SQL to do that, using placeholders for the password hash and ID fields. Now that we no longer need them, let's also set the reset token hash and reset token expires at columns to null. Then we can prepare the statement and bind values of the password hash and the user's ID to the parameters. Then we can execute the statement. Finally, let's just output a message. As before, it would be better at this point to redirect to another page that said this, where you could even include a link to the login page. But to keep this video simple, I'll just leave this message. Let's give that a try from the top. We'll go to the Forgot Password page and submit an email address. We get an email with a link to the password reset page. If I click on that, we can enter a new password. In the database, we can see that the reset token hash and reset token expires at columns have been set to null for that record. Now if we go to the login page, we can log in with the new password. There's a link to all the code shown in this video in the description, along with links to sites shown and relevant documentation. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.